In your estimation, so we'll let you answer this briefly, and then we'll elaborate more on the next program. In your estimation, is there any good reason why a male inmate should be transferred to a female institution?
I can't come up with any good reason. I can come up with a number of reasons it shouldn't happen, but I can't come up with a single reason it should.
Predator Watch finds a brief overview of important stories in the news or issues of concern as they relate to understanding the nature of sexual predators, their characteristics, how their minds operate, their methods of manipulation, and what motivates them. They hide in plain sight, can smell an opportunity a mile away, and count on people not understanding just how dark their hearts are and how intent they are about always producing victims. Stay tuned as Jon Uhler, a licensed professional counselor with over 25 years of professional experience treating both survivors and sexual predators, shares his insights on this edition of Predator Watch.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jon Uhler. This is the Predator Watch podcast. I have as my guest an expert in the field of corrections, Ken Herdman. He recently retired from the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, where I also retired, though not as long. I had 11 plus years. Ken 25 years? 24 years. You served in a number of capacities, both as a housing unit counselor. That's a name. Things have been euphemistically changed. You worked on a cell block managing all the paperwork and keeping things in order. And then after a number of years, you had an opportunity to transition to what was called a treatment specialist position, where you ran quite a few groups, violence prevention, as well as batterers group. So you saw a lot of the different kinds of inmates and their temperaments and their personalities and their offenses. And we're looking at and discussing now the issue of men under the guise of, quote unquote, identifying as a female, being transferred into a female prison. My contention is we're putting women in harm's way at great risk. We ended the last program with me asking you the question, can you think of any reason why a man should be transferred, a male inmate should be transferred in with female inmates? Your point was well taken. He said, well, from a guy's perspective, that's like just a wonderful opportunity, but from a woman's perspective, or as far as the safety of female inmates, you replied how?
I can't think of any good reason that a man should be transferred into a female institution. From the guy's point of view, I can think of a few. But generally speaking, I cannot think of any.
We have, quote unquote, academic experts, but where do those people work? They tend to work in the halls of academia. They will try to gain access. That's a lengthy process to come into an institution for a couple of hours or a couple of days. They will take their information back, typically after interviewing inmates, and they'll take that back, and now they can write a definitive report or definitive research report that has now insightful findings. I'm not suggesting that somebody can't derive good information, but what I have said on a number of occasions is that those that, if you really want to be able to understand the minds and the characters and characteristics of those that are behind bars, to come in for an hour or two or three or a couple of days, you're never gonna get at that. Right? You have to be able to work with them in an embedded situation. That becomes what amounts to field research. Almost like the Jane Goodall had to go live with live with her subjects. So that's why I consider you are an expert, because 25 years behind bars, you know it.
I have a story for you there, John. Were we carpooling when I was taking master's classes?
As a matter of fact, we were, and I should mention to people that is also how we know one another. We not only worked at the my last institution for a couple of years, but if you want to get to know somebody, carpool with them. And so Ken and I were carpool partners there for a couple of years. So yes, you had taken masters. You were starting to take some of those courses.
Did I tell you that I had walked over to the criminology building and spoke with a professor over there?
Remind me.
Well, I was inquiring about the possibility of some sort of a part-time position with the school in the crim department. And I spoke with this professor, explained who I was and that I had my degree from this college and was coming back to take English classes. But she told me that she had been doing research with inmates and was questioning them. She had them filling out questionnaires, which, a lot of researchers do. And the inmates just love to fill out questionnaires, get to play with the pencil and write all sorts of interesting responses to the questions, chuckle to themselves while they do so. But she was questioning them on when they had their kind of defining experience to tell them when they needed to change their behaviors or something along those lines. I advised her that if she wanted to do that type of research and ask those sort of questions, that the best population would be parole violators, people who had some time in, who had been in and out of the institutions at least once, but ideally more than once, because they are the ones who have been through the system enough that they've actually begun to think about changing. There's a huge leap between thinking about something and actually following through with it. The look I received from her was one of distaste. Because those who teach do not like to be told by those who are underneath, those who are at a lower level. Here I am, a bachelor's level. Granted, at the time I had probably 27 years of combined experience between probation, parole, and the prison system. But still, I was uneducated. But there is no substitution for real-world experience.
The majority of people who are law-abiding and have never been to a jail or prison would have absolutely no idea what really goes on inside these institutions and jails.
Behind the concrete and razor wire prisons, you enter a world almost impossible to imagine. Brutal, violent, unpredictable, where gangs battle for control and inmates attack officers to make their bones.
This place is crazy. It wears on you. Like I said, you can't teach this job to anybody.
A lot of people have the misconception that these are people that made a mistake and came in. These guys haven't made mistakes. They intentionally injured somebody to get here.
That's all we deal with for years is people trying to game us and get over on us, So that's one of the big things is they're highly manipulative.
We never know when we're going to be attacked, either by a group, by an individual, either with a weapon, without a weapon, or what many of us consider to be one of the worst attacks, the gassings.
When you get gas, that's one of the worst things that can happen to you.
Gassing is when inmates throw urine, feces, or other body fluids on officers, exposing them to AIDS, hepatitis, and other deadly diseases.
We had a feeling he was going to try and gas us by the way he was acting, so we made him made him approach the slot with his hands behind his back, and good thing we did.
The gassing's pretty not good to see, you know. So you just see the stuff come flying through the door, or just getting all over either staff's face or right here. But when it hits the face, it's pretty disturbing, you know. The pants and everything, that's disturbing. But when it goes in the face, it's it's an eerie feeling, it's an ugly feeling, it's a degrading feeling.
What we have here is our weapons board that we've collected throughout the years.
They're very ingenious, but you have to remember they have 24 hours a day to figure these things out.
This is only about maybe a 1% of all the weapons that we've recovered since we opened this institution. These are from inmates tearing the dining hall carts apart. We have soda pop cans, parts of food trays.
They use all kinds of weapon stock. These plastic ones are made from, say, their shampoo bottles that they melt down. They used to be able to smoke. They had lighters and all of that. And we took the lighters away because, as you can see, not only do they melt down plastic to make weapons, they also use the lighter for a weapon. And we used to allow them to get regular toothbrushes in. Then we found out they started using it as weapons. We take that away.
I've seen officers get speared from the shower, arrows come out, and we initially we'd go down with just a vest. Then they were shooting so many arrows out at us and darts that we went down with shields, like welder's masks, that were reasonably thick plastic. But then one inmate got one, he used a copper tip out of a coax cable, and it penetrated the shield and hit an officer right here, right below the eye. So now we wear helmets that have thicker shields.
That is a cuff key. It's made out of one of their little toothbrushes. And these inmates, you can figure that a good 50% of them are packing that at all times. It unlocks their cuffs, so you put cuffs on an inmate, you escort him out of his cell, they can get out of their restraints. This was a half a pair of scissors, and he put that up his rectum. Problem was, the point cut him, and then he started getting a stomach ache. It lacerated his colon and had to go to the hospital, and that's how we found out he had that up there.
With few hiding places, inmates often smuggle contraband by inserting weapons or drugs into their rectums, called keistering.
There's a sheath they covered up, and that way they can secrete it in their rectum.
We make them get totally unclothed, we make them squat, cough, everything. But if they've got it up there, we can't find it. And they get out in the yard, and maybe they're jogging or they're hanging with their friends in the yard, and when they're ready to assault somebody, if you're watching, and sometimes you have 200 inmates on the yard, so you can't watch every single one of them. They'll go over and they'll squat when no one's watching. They'll grab their weapon out of their rectum, and then they'll go over and assault whoever they're going to assault with it.
Get out! Get out! Get out! Break it up! Get out! Get out!
Tammy Hanlon was an officer at Pelican Bay when she responded to a riot in August 1999.
There were several inmates over here laying on the ground. I ran over here, somewhere in this area, and I was going to go over to this building, B8 over here, and get some handcuffs. And I noticed an inmate that was sitting up right here, and he looked like he was going to jump up. So I went over to him and I said, "You need to lay down on your stomach." And two inmates over, this inmate jumped up, and that's when I turned like this, and he hit me twice, and I flew off my feet and landed somewhere back here. I didn't get up right away. I think I was knocked out. And there was all kinds of inmates moving around at that time. Apparently, an officer came from over here, and she pulled me up and pulled me into the building over here. I walked into B8, very stunned. Basically, it shattered this entire cheekbone right here into one major big fracture and lots of small fractures that basically they had to do surgery on, but they couldn't do it until after the swelling went down. I looked like an alien for about two weeks, I think. It was a pretty big face.
4,000 inmates jammed into a place designed for 2,000. The mood is tense. People are still recovering from a riot here 2 years ago. 24 officers were hurt. It didn't end until an inmate took a fatal bullet fired by an officer in that tower.
August 18th.
Okay, August 18th, 2005, and an inmate stabbed somebody who has the very same job as you in the head.
He was stabbed. He was patting down, and the inmate had a weapon. So the inmate turned around and stabbed the officer.
With that terrible day serving as a constant, ominous backdrop, our prison tour begins.
They're going back into their house.
We're told to refer to officers by last name only. We're warned against running across the prison yard. Just that is enough to incite the inmates. We are reminded of a sobering state policy. If we are taken hostage, they will not negotiate for our release. And before we enter the next building, even more drastic security measures are taken.
They call this the hole. The baddest of the bad are housed here, and the level of tension is reflected accordingly. Anyone who enters here is required to wear a stab-proof vest like this. And any time an inmate is removed from the cell, he's shackled at the hands and often at the feet.
We have murderers, we have rapists, we have people who committed robbery, people who battered people with great bodily injury, carjacking, gang type.
And why do you always wear gloves?
A lot of the inmates here have hepatitis C, some have HIV, and then not only that, but because I'm a female, and these are male inmates, just a way of not, having skin to skin.
No arousal.
Right, exactly.
Of the 20,000 correction officers in the state, less than 1/4 are women. When females were first hired in the 70s, some of the men quit in protest. These female officers have come a long way since then.
It's a dangerous unit. We have a staff assault of inmates in here, or a lot of these inmates are in here for stabbing other inmates. So we have a close, tight-knit group here.
And they need to be tight-knit. One mistake, and you could be dead.
Rodriguez!
Half of the inmates here are lifers. The officers arrange a meeting with one of them. We are allowed to talk to him as long as he's inside a cage. He's a murderer who's been in and out of jail since he was 12.
And what is it like to have them be some of your only daily contact with other human beings?
Well, I mean, I'm a man. I love women. You see them, but I'm not no sexual predator or nothing like that. You just it's like having a steak or something you can't eat. Always right there in front of you. You know what I mean?
Which is a perfect segue back into, let me ask the next question. We're talking about trans inmates under the umbrella concern of women, female inmates having male inmates placed within a prison setting. Nearly half, so 24 of the 50 states, have a single female institution in that state. So 24 out of 50 of the states only have one female prison, which means any guy from any of the male institutions, if he is granted a transfer, he's going to go to that one prison.
Next, we have this from the Daily Wire. Former and current female inmates, speaking of prison populations, former and current female inmates from liberal states like California and Washington are speaking out about gender laws which allow biologically male inmates who identify as female to share prison cells with them. One woman recalled sharing, and this gets a little graphic, by the way, just a fair warning, but I think everyone needs to know what's going on here. So, a little graphic, but one woman recalled sharing a cell with a man who sustained, quote, a full erection. Another noted how female inmates, many victims of past sexual assault, are arming themselves out of fear of victimization from 300-pound men who, quote, look like Hercules. Those women spoke to Abigail Schreier, author of Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, a book which I read recently and I've talked about on this show, and I would highly recommend that book to everyone. But they spoke with her, and she was talking about their plight. Former inmate Tyrena Griffin told Schreier that, quote, many of the men who are transferring there aren't even on hormonal medication. She told the author, quote, they're getting a full erection. So you're locked in this room 24/7 with a man, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you tell the police you don't want to live with a man or you're afraid or whatever, you'll get a disciplinary infraction. So you're basically punished for being scared. Another former inmate, Amy Ichikawa, explained that Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla does not separate inmates based on severity of crime due to the nature of women's facilities being significantly less violent than men's facilities. So when biologically male inmates are transferred in, they're mixed with inmates without regard to the nature of their crime. Ichikawa said, quote, "We're all mixed together. The people who've murdered their children are in the same room as the people who've stolen boxers from Walmart."
You take a guy who's going to be locked up for a number of years, sex offender or not, transfer him into a women's institution, and what the hell do you think is going to happen?
And what is it like to have them be some of your only daily contact with other human beings?
Well, I mean, I'm a man. I love women. You know, you see them, but I'm not no sexual predator or nothing like that. You just like, it's like having a steak or something you can't eat, always right there in front of you. You know what I mean?
So putting women, many of them not even violent criminals, you know, shoplifters, people, illegal drug users and so on, locking them in cells with these large violent men for 24 hours a day, that is cruel and unusual punishment. It is unconstitutional. It's a horrifying form of torture and neglect. And these women are being literally silenced. We hear so much about, well, women are being silenced. In most cases, that's not the case at all. Most of the women who are out screaming that they're being silenced, well, they're screaming and we hear them, so they're not being silenced. But these women in prison, they are literally being silenced. As we heard from one of them say, if they speak out against it, or if they object, if they say, "Hey, this is a dude you've just put me in a prison cell with. This is a dude who isn't even making an effort to pretend that he's a woman." If they say that, they get punished for it. If you really cared at all about, number one, women's rights, and number two, the unjust suffering and the unjust punishment of criminals, if you cared about any of that or all of it, then you'd be speaking out loudly about this. You'd be holding press conferences about this. And all of this is based on, we're putting men in women's prisons. It's based on the honor system. Like you might as well just have no bars and no walls in the prison and base the entire thing on the honor system. Here's your spot where you're supposed to be in jail for the next 27 years. We're not going to have any guards. We're not going to have any walls or anything. Honor system, okay? I mean, you're a murderer. I'm sure we can trust your personal sense of honor and integrity.
One mistake, and you could be dead.
Rodriguez!
Half of the inmates here are lifers. The officers arrange a meeting with one of them. We are allowed to talk to him as long as he's inside a cage. He's a murderer who's been in and out of jail since he was 12.
And what is it like to have them be some of your only daily contact with other human beings?
Well, I mean, I'm a man. I love women. You know, you see them, but I'm not no sexual predator or nothing like that. You just like, it's like having a steak or something you can't eat, always right there in front of you. You know what I mean?
So on the honor system, they're letting men into women's prisons because the men claim that they identify as women or really feel deep down that they're women. There's no way to confirm that. It's just they said it. And so, who would lie? This is a murderer and sex offender. He wouldn't lie about this. And of course, even if we could confirm that they really do identify as women, that wouldn't make a damn bit of difference because they still don't belong in women's prisons because they're not women. But the point is that a lot of these guys, they don't even really identify as women. They identify as far as just saying, "Oh yeah, I'm a woman." In fact, if you're a violent male criminal in a place like California, why wouldn't you, at this point, just come out and say, yeah, I'm a woman too. Send me to the women's prison.
Tonight, a special report on what's taking place inside California's female prisons. In September 2020, Governor Gavin Newsom signed Senate Bill 132 into law, requiring prisons to house inmates based on their chosen gender identity. Now, biological men are sharing prison cells with terrified women, and one woman is reportedly pregnant. NTD's Grace Coulter has the story.
In California, biological male criminals are allowed to be housed in female prisons if they identify as women. Women's Liberation Front, or WOLF, a feminist organization which is in direct contact with inmates and staff, tells NTD that at least one woman in Central California Women's Facility is pregnant as a result of the male inmates. Because pregnancy is private health data, the reports cannot be verified with the prison.
Some of the men have been rounded up and put in segregation on the yard where the woman who is supposedly pregnant. So they've taken 3 of them and put them in administrative segregation.
Lauren Adams is Wolf's legal counsel. She says several weeks ago, the prison began giving out condoms and providing information about inmates' options if they get pregnant. At the time, Wolf called the new resources a tacit admission by officials that women should expect to be raped when housed in prison with men, where all sex is considered non-consensual by default within the system. Adams says she thinks many people picture someone like Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black when they think of transgender prisoners, but she says this is far from the truth. Many of the ones now housed in female prisons still look like men, and some, she said, are reportedly not taking their hormones, and one has grown a beard. And worse yet, Adams says some of the men that have been transferred into women's prisons are sex offenders.
One of the men who is in the yard where the pregnant woman is and who has been put in segregation is a sex offender. He has been convicted of multiple forcible rapes, but that's not what he's serving time for this time.
She says another male inmate housed in the California Institution for Women is serving time for molesting 2 children. As of April, around 250 biological male prisoners filed requests to transfer to women's prisons. So far, only about 20 transfers have been processed. None have been denied. Numerous women have written to Wolf saying they're terrified.
Having to use the toilet in front of men, having to shower in front of men. It's demoralizing and humiliating. We have religious women in there who, as part of their practice of their religion, rely on sex separation. And so on a daily 24-hour basis, they're being, that right's being infringed upon. It's really unreal.
She says the female inmates never got a say in the law, and even now, their calls for help go unheard. Adams says they feel forgotten.
They just feel like nobody cares about us, nobody cares about our safety, nobody cares about our feelings. 86% of incarcerated women have histories of sexual or physical abuse. Many have PTSD. The mental health options in there are very limited, and I don't know how you treat anxiety that's associated with literally being locked up with a sex offender. It's not like you can medicate that away or counsel it away.
In a July phone call to Wolf, one female inmate said prison guards told inmates they won't segregate the men from the women's cells because they're worried about getting sued.
And how do you think that we feel? We do not feel safe knowing you're scared of a lawsuit. We do not feel safe that you're going to put them in our room because you're afraid they'll claim discrimination, when all along the discrimination has been against us.
Adams said the situation cannot be blamed on the prisons, since the policy was made law by California politicians. She said some of the legislators were trying to protect transgender individuals.
But, the solution to men being victimized in men's prisons is not to change who the victims are. It's not to, instead of having male victims, now we have female victims.
Fundamentally, she says, women deserve to be housed in single-sex prisons.
We're not clownfish, we're not frogs. We are born how we're born, and that doesn't change no matter how much we see ourselves in a certain way. So I think that we need to remember that we're not housing identities, we're housing people.
She says for the most part, there's been silence over what's now taking place in the prisons. Likely, she says, because many people are afraid of taking a position and being called transphobic. Adams says the time has come for people to be brave and speak up. To read the letters from incarcerated women or sign the petition to halt the transfer of men into women's prisons, you can go to Women's Liberation Front's website. Grace Coulter, NTD News.
And the question is, are we putting dangerous inmates, and is it ever safe to send any male in there? My contention, and then I'll ask you the question, my contention is you can have a lot of different guys apply for, so suddenly identify with a woman, the stats, and I've seen different stats in different situations, but they'll say, well, about 50% are sex offenders. Well, that on paper it looks like, well, the other half wouldn't be dangerous. Well, that's because people don't understand about the plea bargaining situation, and I'll have you speak to that in a moment. But then also, right? But then also you can have a pimp who would be willing to, because most people don't think, they think, well, a normal guy wouldn't stoop so low or would be so brazen as to identify, say he's identifying with a female, because that would not be masculine or something. So can speak to the issue of, first of all, let's tackle the stats first. So people are saying, well, half of the inmates that are applying for these transfers that identify as female, they're probably safe because they're not sex offenders. So talk about the issue of, can somebody commit a sex-related crime, get charges, but not be convicted, so on paper, in their file, it appears like they are not a sex offender?
A little bit. These are men who, if I understand correctly, and I guess it depends on the state a little bit, but they don't have to have surgery or anything, right? They not that even would make it okay, but they don't have to have surgery or anything, right? These are just men who are being put in women's prisons because they declare that they feel like women.
Yeah, so I talked to the women of the Chowchilla prison, which is the highest security. It's technically called the Central California Correctional Facility, colloquially known as the Chowchilla prison. And this is the highest security women's prison in the state of California. These women are tough women, but they are terrified because now a new law allows men, biological men, to transfer in. All they need to do is declare a female identity. No surgery or hormones are required for them to become eligible for transfer. And the reason, and that we have these laws in a few states now. Washington has the same policy. A woman was raped by one of the biological men who was placed in her prison. I've been in, there have even been serial rapists who are declared a female identity and were put in women's prison in the state of Washington. And the problem is even more serious and dire than I was able to convey, because in the future, as these laws, continue to exist, right now the men are transferring into women's prison from men's prison, so we can track them. But in laws like Washington, where you can just change your birth certificate, and in California, where you go into the system now as a female, it will be extremely difficult for reporters to even be able to track who these men were. It will look like women on women violence when they rape and assault the female inmates.
And part of the problem, right, is that in women's prisons, a lot of them anyway, they don't segregate based on the severity of crime as strictly as they do in men's prisons, because there isn't as much violence to begin with until you start putting the men in there. So you could have, a man convicted of murder in there with women who, shoplifted or something, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, one thing that I learned from the women prisoners, which I didn't know and I was able to corroborate, was that not only are a huge number of female prisoners abuse survivors, sexual abuse survivors, but very often when they committed crimes, and a lot of these women committed very serious crimes, they did it at the behest of a scary man they were involved with. So these are women who have been pushed around by men their whole lives, and are, even though these are very tough women, the men transferring in, male convicts are quite scary. They're huge. Often they are extremely strong, and they can easily overpower them. And these women are terrified.
You mentioned the one case of a woman who was raped by a male prisoner sent in there. Are you aware of any other cases? Because it strikes me that this is probably happening a lot, just given what we're doing here, how we're mixing things together. But it also strikes me that we would never find out about it So are you aware of any other cases like that?
I am not, and I'll tell you why. It's very complicated because you hear even from the women that the men who are in there can very often, even if there's a sexual relationship, it's hard to tell if it's consensual. And the reason is the women are trapped in small cells with them. So the women will, in some cases, will say that it is consensual, but a lot of the other prisoners disbelieve that, given how much stronger the men are and how trapped the women feel. And remember, these cells, the women's cells are, everyone is just together. There aren't. You don't, because women are less violent, they're not set up to keep people separate or to safeguard women from each other. So the men who enter really have free reign.
One other thing on this seems to me, well, the whole thing really, but especially when it comes to women's prisons, you've got a real women's rights issue here. Yeah. Has there been any interest among the Me Too crowd, left-wing feminists at all? Have they shown any interest in this story and wanted to follow up on it or anything like that?
No, women, feminist groups today. I mean, I think just this week, the National Organization of Women declared that trans women are women and are to be treated as such. Feminist organizations in general in America have completely betrayed women. They can't wait to give away women's rights. And they couldn't care less about the female prisoners, who are not only a very vulnerable population, they have no political clout, so no one's looking out for them. Democratic politicians don't care. By and large, Republicans don't either. They don't vote. So there's no natural constituency. You just have to have something of a conscience to care about what happens to these women.
I'm trying to collect my thoughts. Sex offender or not, and you previously gave me permission to speak bluntly, at the risk of potentially offending some of your viewers. And I may have mentioned this in our last segment, or touched on it. You take a guy who's going to be locked up for a number of years, sex offender or not, transfer him into a women's institution, and what the hell do you think is going to happen?
Well, we'll have to interrupt the interview with Ken Herdman at this point due to time constraints, but be sure to join us for the third and final part of this important interview regarding the dangers women are placed in whenever biological men are placed in women's prisons.
You've been listening to Predator Watch, dedicated to shining the light of truth about the nature of the most sophisticated of sexual predators most likely to target places where victims are most easily accessed. For Jon Uhler and the entire team, thanks for listening.
Predator Watch has been sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. As a non-profit organization, Survivor Support is dependent upon the generosity of people who believe in its mission of supporting survivors. Please consider becoming a monthly supporter of this important work.